A fictitious scenario that could become reality. People learn on TV that a deadly disease is spreading worldwide and there's nothing they can do about it.
Zugvögel schleppen das Virus in die Türkei ein. Von dort erobert es Ost- und Südeuropa.
We talk of a pandemic when an infectious disease spreads not only from country to country, but also from one continent to another.
Imagine a huge wave of disease sweeping across various countries and finally over Germany as well. How would we, as pastoral workers in emergencies, as a church, cope with the situation? This is something we're starting to think about.
The Protestant Church's pastoral workers have proved their value in extreme situations, providing support for accident victims and their families. But not even they are prepared for a pandemic. Epidemics claiming millions of lives are nothing new. Europe has been struck by the plague many times. Over 25 million people died from the Spanish flu. AIDS is also a pandemic, and worldwide phenomena like bird flu give true cause for concern. Pastoral workers recently took part in Lukex, a pandemic simulation on a vast new scale staged by ministries, the armed forces, the police and the disaster control service.
What you in the crisis team must remember is that there'll be lots of inquiries concerning the whereabouts of relatives, if and when certain places are open, and so on. All these inquiries will have to be collected and processed.
Practice for the Church's crisis team for giving pastoral care in the worst conceivable chaos. Early evening in the village of Fischbach. Only a few minutes ago, Pastor Hans-Lothar Hülscher received an emergency call. The pandemic threatens to bring the healthcare system to a standstill. The hospital in a neighboring village is completely overburdened and cannot admit any more infected people. In another part of the scenario, the voluntary fire service has received a call-out.
It's about helping to move patients to another hospital, so lots of people will be needed to do the carrying. To be on the safe side, I'm going to drive to the fire station and accompany the men on their call-out. We'll bring them back to us in Fischbach and put them up in the parish hall. Great care will be needed. Pastor Hülscher will tell you more. Yes, great care is essential because people will be sitting or lying there who have already experienced so much and will, of course, be very scared. We'll focus solely on providing pastoral care. I'll come along and will be with you. So our aim will be to make sure panic isn't added to what they have suffered already.
That's it. Time to move out. The mood is somber because the men don't know exactly what to expect. A week after the outbreak of a pandemic, a third of the population would be infected, including the firefighters. Everybody is at risk, and no one knows whether the protective clothing will be adequate. Despite this, Hans-Lothar Hülscher decides not to don a full-body protective suit, because a pastoral worker covered from head to toe would be more likely to frighten patients than console them. Pastor Hülscher travels along in the team truck, as he often does on major exercises. It's important for the emergency services too to know that the priest is with them at all times. A pandemic taking a still uncontrollable course gives rise to more than a queasy feeling. Worry and uncertainty prove draining.
Issues arise regarding our very existence, issues we don't normally have to deal with. We go in and hope we'll make it back out safely, and we hope we've done our work well. But in the case of a pandemic, you're confronted with your own existence, with the possibility of becoming infected yourself, of dying, of infecting your family. And I think it's good to consider this in times of peace, so to speak, and not to wait until it actually happens and you're in the middle of things.
The first immediate task on this particular evening is to put some patients in quarantine, albeit provisionally. Lothar Hilscher has to explain this to his young helpers. He calmly tells them that the next hospital is already completely overcrowded, so alternative accommodation has to be found, like a church.
All talk, any feelings or thoughts that might arise, that's all out of place here. There'll be time for that back at the fire station afterwards.
The firemen are uneasy. You can't see the dangers of an epidemic like you can with a fire. The priest, as a pastoral worker, tries to set an example. It's a case of being very careful with regard to the risk of infection, but without giving any cause for panic. We'll stay here and inform the relatives, he says, because at the moment they're not allowed in here. Hans Lothar Hilscher had to learn to control his emotions.
I've learned to take a bit of a step back in these situations. This jacket is my personal protection. I have a role to play. There are people before me I'm not related to, people who are strangers. That's important. Where my emotions are concerned, I can remain at something of a distance. With relatives and where colleagues from the rescue teams are involved, the situation automatically comes a lot closer, and that's more dangerous. These people matter to me, but I mustn't let their situation become my personal problem. I can't help them with my personal commiseration. I could do this for a short while, but then I'd be exhausted. And then I'd no longer be able to work, so taking a professional attitude also involves maintaining a certain distance from things. If any cracks appear in this form of protection, it has a disastrous effect on our ability to work.
The nerve centre of the Lükex exercise at the Federal Office of Civil Protection and Disaster Assistance in Bonn. Experts here take the possible outbreak of a pandemic very seriously. They regard it as a real threat.
Lükex, the nationwide crisis management exercise, is the third of its kind. Basically, it focuses on cooperation between the national government and the various federal states. The background this time is a pandemic flu scenario. Large sections of the populace are sick and many people have cried off work. In this context, we practice how, for instance, the population could be kept supplied with goods and services.
The emergency pastoral workers have set up their own crisis team in Düsseldorf. Communication routes have to be studied and staff prepared for sudden deployment. The exercise must be realistic. If a third of the population is infected, everyone will be involved, including the pastoral workers. So how can spiritual care be guaranteed if staff are missing everywhere? In hospitals and supermarkets, in the police and fire services. Hans Lothar Hilscher has come to prepare helpers mentally.
With so many people going down sick, we're very concerned about providing for the elderly and those needing care. Shortages of supplies are giving rise to hoarding. We've also noticed that people are becoming more and more frightened and that extremists are taking advantage of the situation. What's more, only 7 of our 23 emergency pastoral workers are still able to work. You're right. Things are getting bad. I've just been at the cemetery. We had no less than 3 funerals today. Several colleagues in other parishes are already out of action.
The shopping centre is deserted, an eerie scene. Outside, deathly silence everywhere. Public life has virtually come to a standstill. Because of the risk of infection, in many places gatherings are now prohibited. So Pastor Hilscher has held what, for the time being, will be his last church service. This could well be the scenario in the event of a pandemic.
There's no doubt that I'd be afraid. When you've got a family, you wonder what it would be like if you had sick people at home. What if I became ill myself? After all, nobody would be safe. With an unknown pathogen involved, vaccines would first have to be found, and who knows how effective they'd be. We'll need a total rethink. When we see what life is like then, we'll realize what really matters and what is no longer important.
Dann wird sich was ist wichtig und was ist dann nicht mehr wichtig.
3 members of the parish council have stayed for a chat with Pastor Hilscher. He wants to make sure that interpersonal relationships don't break down completely because of the risk of infection. As an emergency pastoral worker, he himself is constantly on the go.
Die aktuelle Lage ist so,
A lot of us have also been affected, of course. The head of our Help for Women group is ill in bed. She's in a bad way. We ought to visit her. She's expecting
ihr
it.
ganz schlecht. Wir sollten sie besuchen gehen. Sie warten drauf. Sie haben mir das am Telefon gesagt.
Ich finde das ganz schwierig.
I'd find that very difficult. On the one hand, I really would like to visit her because that is what we ought to do. But I'm in a real dilemma.
Sitzt man dann in der Zwickmühle. Wie weit stecke ich mich an?
What's the risk of me becoming infected? And would I then infect my family? My husband isn't in the best of health.
Mein Mann auch nicht so ganz gesund ist, vielleicht stecke ich
And
dann
perhaps I would infect him. Wouldn't a phone call be enough?
Zweifel reicht nicht, der Telefonanruf.
Ich weiß auch, also ich könnte mir auch vorstellen, dass
I could imagine that it's not absolutely necessary for us to go in person. I also feel that it might be dangerous for us.
ja auch, dass das für uns gefährlich sein könnte. Also
I think I'll have another long chat with Gisela on the phone.
Dass ich noch mal einen ausführlichen Telefonanruf mache bei der Gisela.
Also ich wäre bereit hinzufahren.
I'm quite willing to drive over there because I feel that in the present situation, a personal visit is particularly important. If I were in that position, I'd be happy if someone came to see me instead of just phoning. When someone is really ill, especially someone who is very close to us, it's vital, I think, to pay a personal visit.
Es ist wichtig, dass man persönlich hingeht.
Jo, also Victoria, vielen Dank.
Thank you, Victoria. But it doesn't mean your decision is any less valid. I can well understand you. And we'll have the same discussions at home. The fact is that it's more urgent than ever for telephone contact to be maintained. Perhaps we could set up call chains. If we can't actually see one another, then it's important for us to stick together by at least talking on the phone. That way, no one gets the idea that we're drifting apart.
Wir lassen uns da nicht auseinandertreiben und wir halten die Verbindung.
The women know the limits of their willingness to make sacrifices, and it's important for them to admit it to themselves. Pastor Hilscher can also fulfill his pastoral duties from home. He can reach a lot of people through the internet.
Guten Abend, liebe Gemeindemitglieder.
Good evening, parishioners, and anyone else who's online. Welcome to our brief daily broadcast. The crisis, which has hit everyone in this country, has also hit the church. I've had an extremely eventful day. Like you, probably, I have experienced tempers getting heated as certain groups are held responsible for the pandemic that's spreading.
Weil bestimmte Personengruppen verantwortlich gemacht werden für die sich greifende Pandemie.
Once again, it's foreigners who are being made the scapegoat, but they are just as badly affected as we are. I can only urge you all to display brotherly love to everyone. Show solidarity when you talk to your neighbours, and especially to the people in our town who come from abroad. Let us at least set a good example.
Dass wir wenigstens mit einem guten Beispiel vorangehen.
We consider the various phases of a disaster, and we know there comes a point when a scapegoat is found, someone whose fault it is, someone who could have done things differently or better, and usually foreigners are meant. That's a feature of every disaster, and we are preparing for it. The talks on this that are being given are important and necessary, and I think they're having an effect and sinking into people's heads.
Hans-Lothar Hilscher is used to being the bearer of tragic news. At such times, relatives should not be left alone. But in a pandemic, the need for pastoral support would escalate enormously.
Da muss Verbindung bleiben.
There must be contact. People cannot be left at home, completely isolated from God and the world. We must also see that institutions like hospitals and old people's homes are maintained. And we might be confronted with questions of an ethical nature, like who's going to be vaccinated? And what are we going to do with people who really cannot be helped?
Denen man wirklich nicht mehr helfen kann.
Hilscher is certain that even in a pandemic, he'd risk visiting people whose lives were threatened. He sees it as the responsibility of a priest. In the event of a global epidemic, scientists expect things to happen in waves. The first wave of infections would see many people unprotected. Only total isolation would help. But by the time of the second wave, about 2 months later, the pathogen could have been identified and a vaccine developed. But what is clear is that at first it would not be possible to produce anywhere near enough vaccine. And it's this problem that the Church Crisis Team is focusing on. How to deal responsibly with a situation in which there is not sufficient protection for all.
Some people will have been vaccinated, but others won't have. So at best, all we can do is provide care for those who haven't been vaccinated. If enough vaccine is available, I assume we will be among those chosen to receive it. In the public interest, decisions will have to be taken on who should be vaccinated, who should survive in order to maintain various services, and who should go without vaccine and run the risk of becoming sick. This class division will exist, but it mustn't be referred to as such. People will soon say, though, it's all right for you to talk, you've been vaccinated.
There's the principle that all people are equal, but it might be a case of first come, first served. That's not our problem. We must look at the concepts we have for caring for those people who are turned away.
In the event of a pandemic, questions about the value of life would suddenly become extremely pertinent. The situation in old people's homes, for instance, would become aggravated. The popular press would discuss whether it was actually worth vaccinating the old and infirm. Would Hans-Lothar Hilscher have a clear conscience if he came here to provide pastoral care after having been vaccinated?
As in all previous exercises, and as in all the years in which the operations were for real, the main criterion is that someone who's supposed to provide assistance must be in a position to do so. Helpers, decision makers take priority, of course. The second rule is that personal protection must come first, and every helper must be able to accept this with a clear conscience. If I don't protect myself, then I can't function. If I drop out, there won't be any help.
The risk of infection in the old folks' home is huge, and people are worried. Here, the pastoral care concept is geared to speaking openly about the inevitable situation. Pastor Hilscher tells this elderly lady that 30% of the population would fall ill. Considering that Germany has 80 million inhabitants, that would be an enormous number, and some people would die. Those who couldn't protect themselves, and anyone who was in a weak condition anyway, would be at an even greater risk. The important thing, he says, is to avoid panic breaking out. But the old lady thinks that would happen anyway. We'd all be scared, the priest says. Fear of death, but also of losing one's dignity. The absolute protection of human dignity is firmly anchored in the German constitution, the basic law, which guarantees equal participation in a free community. But a pandemic would prove a huge acid test for the ethical values of society as a whole.
We all have to die sometime, but that's not the way I imagine dying.
Those taking part in the exercise agree that a pandemic would see a dramatic rise in the death rate, especially amongst the elderly. Emergency pastoral workers would strive to uphold people's dignity.
The Bible, of course, certainly has something to say on accepting death like we accept life. It's about practicing this composure and then falling into good hands, into the hands of God when death comes. And what is written in the Bible gives me the necessary composure. If the pandemic struck me personally and it was my turn to go, I would say, perhaps, that it was a bit early, that I hadn't planned it that way, but what actually is planned in our lives.
Bitte, was im Leben ist eigentlich alles schon geplant? Der Prediger im Alten Testament sagt es auch.
The Old Testament also says, live now. Everything has its time. Your life has its time, then the day will come. You know the day, but not the hour. Then you will leave this life. Do not cling too much. Decide now what is important and what is not. Do some things, but leave others. A crisis like the one we're reconstructing helps to attach totally new values to things and to find one's bearings.
Anna Hilscher has been married to Hans Lothar for 30 years. They have 3 grown-up children. Only the youngest still lives at home. The scenario of the pandemic exercise has inexorably confronted the Hilschers with the fundamental question of what takes priority for them personally. The family, their children, responsibility, a sense of duty, their faith. Hans Lothar tells Anna about the meeting he had and that he insisted on emergency pastoral workers being vaccinated as well. He put down 20 names and they were all accepted. But he asks his wife, do you know precisely what that means within our particular area? Does she know precisely who will receive an injection? Yes, you, she says. But what about us? There won't be enough for the family, Hans Lothar has to tell her. He's not at all happy about the situation, but feels the decision just has to be accepted. Up to now, Anna Hilscher has supported her husband unconditionally in his role as an emergency pastoral worker. She understands that he has to be vaccinated, but says they have to see how they deal with the situation privately. And he'll have to ring the children and inform them. They must stay where they are, he says, and Lothar admits that the decisions of conscience were the ultimate test.
I'd find it really tough if someone in my family fell ill. There would certainly be an urge to stay at home and look after my wife, or to help her care for the children, or for whoever was in the house. My parents, for instance, are very old. So I'm not sure how I would reconcile my domestic duties with my public commitment. That's a decision I could only take in a real emergency.
Das weiß ich noch nicht. Also das werde ich entscheiden, wenn der Fall eintritt.
Preparations for one of the many daily funerals. But how long would it be possible to bury people? The forecast on the Lübeck exercise was that in Germany alone, the pandemic would claim at least 400,000 lives in the first 3 weeks. Maybe 1 million. So ordinary burials would no longer be feasible. Mass burials, or mass cremations because of the epidemic, would take place throughout Europe and on other continents. With a ban on gatherings in place, even for burials, that would present relatives with an intolerable problem. But the technical possibilities available do at least enable some kind of pastoral care to be offered.
Dear friends, I know how hard it is for you to have to stay in your homes instead of being here in church. It means you cannot say farewell as you would have wished, neither to Hannah, your mother, nor to Gerhard, her husband, and your father, nor to daughter and granddaughter, Katharina, nor to Lucas, who was on this earth for less than 2 months. But I promise you that these 4 beloved souls will be laid to rest with all dignity.
Diese 4 geliebten Menschen gleich in aller Würde zu Grabe tragen werden.
Their urns will be buried together here in the cemetery. I shall pray next to their grave. And in a few days, or perhaps a few weeks, you will have a place where you will be able to say farewell, pray and grieve. I wish you strength and the comfort of the Lord in your terrible pain.
It's a totally new way of dealing with families because we are used to closeness, to physical presence. But in such special situations when the alternative would be for nothing to happen, for the dead to be left on their own, this, I believe, is the only solution, and a very good one at that.
Bei dem Verstorbenen, ich glaube, dann ist das die einzige und eine sehr gute Lösung.
Experts say that a pandemic could break out next winter, in 10 years or only in 100 years, but it will come at some time or other. We can practice for this disaster, but we will never be able to control it entirely.
Where a pandemic is concerned, I'm certain that fear also plays a role, and that's quite justified. It would be totally unprofessional and suicidal to say, I can't lose, I'm going in. That's not on, but fear is something I can combat. I'm not completely at its mercy. Concepts, plans exist. And there's my own view, that in the final analysis, there is someone looking after me.
Ja, dass ich letztlich geborgen bin.